Deep in the burning desert, Ethan and his loyal German shepherd Rex stumble upon something no map has ever shown: a massive private jet buried beneath the sand. Inside, they don't find bones, but scattered jewels, torn luxury, and a captain's journal whispering that survivors once lived here. What happened to them, and what secret was powerful enough to erase every trace? Before we begin, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. And if you love stories of mystery and survival, hit like and subscribe, because what Ethan uncovers next will haunt you. The desert stretched endlessly beneath a sky that seemed too large for the earth. In New Mexico, the sun burned mercilessly, pouring heat over the sand like molten copper. The horizon shimmered, blurred by heat waves that twisted the air and made distant rocks appear as if they floated above the ground. The wind carried dust in long ribbons, whispering through dry canyons and rattling against the twisted remains of sagebrush. It was not a welcoming place. Here, everything seemed sharpened, every rock jagged, every shadow stark, every sound amplified. For most, it was a land of trial, not of comfort. Ethan Cole had chosen this place deliberately. At 52 years old, his body still held the frame of a man who had once commanded strength, broad shoulders and tall stature, giving him an air of resilience. But time and grief had drawn deep lines across his face. His dark hair, once thick and steady, had thinned and turned to streaks of gray, while his beard was rough and unkempt, a salt and pepper growth that he rarely bothered to trim. His eyes were a weathered blue, sharp and distant, as if they searched not the desert horizon but something deeper inside himself. He carried himself like a man who had endured much, and indeed he had. Once, Ethan had been a respected aeronautical engineer, the kind of man who built blueprints for machines that defied gravity. He had thrived in a world of precision and calculation, where bolts and rivets mattered as much as vision. Yet the city, with its towering offices and endless meetings, had worn him down. The final blow had not come from work, however, but from home. The death of his only son in a car accident 2 years earlier had cracked him open in ways he had never expected. His marriage had not survived the grief, and the silence of his apartment had become unbearable. With nothing left binding him to the city, Ethan had walked away. He sold what little he still owned, packed a truck with essentials, and decided to vanish into the desert, where silence was not a reminder of loss, but the natural state of the earth. He was not alone. Beside him padded his constant companion, Rex, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a strong, muscular build and a coat of sable fur that glowed reddish in the sunlight. Rex had eyes of deep amber, intelligent and alert, always sweeping the landscape with a soldier's discipline. His ears pricked forward at every sound, his tail a banner of steady confidence. Ethan had adopted Rex as a puppy, and in many ways the dog had been the one thing that kept him moving through the heavy fog of grief. Loyal to a fault, Rex mirrored Ethan's solitude with his own quiet vigilance. Where Ethan carried sorrow in his chest, Rex carried it in his steady presence, never demanding more than companionship, always ready to shoulder the weight of silence. Their journey had begun weeks earlier, when Ethan left the remnants of his life behind and drove into the red canyons and shifting dunes of New Mexico. Now, he had parked his truck at the edge of a forgotten trail and carried his supplies on his back. With Rex trotting by his side, he trekked deeper into the desert, where the map showed nothing but emptiness. To Ethan, emptiness was exactly the point. The sun pressed down as he moved, his boots sinking into loose sand. Each step stirred small storms of dust that clung to his sweat-streaked clothes. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, pulled low to shield his eyes, and a faded khaki shirt rolled up at the sleeves, revealing arms scarred by years of work and accidents. His jeans were stiff with dust, his boots cracked and worn. He looked less like the engineer he once was and more like a wanderer, someone who belonged nowhere and everywhere. At midday, Ethan paused to drink from his canteen, tilting his head back to let the lukewarm water soothe his parched throat. Rex sat beside him, tongue lolling, chest rising and falling with steady breaths. Ethan reached out and scratched behind the dog's ears, and Rex leaned into the touch, tail thumping softly in the sand. "This is it, boy," Ethan muttered, his voice gravelly from the dry air. "No one to bother us here." They set up camp in the shadow of a sandstone cliff, where the rock provided a sliver of shade against the afternoon sunday. Ethan unrolled a weathered canvas tent, its fabric stained from past journeys, and hammered stakes into the hard-packed ground. Rex curled nearby, eyes half closed but ears always twitching, alert to the desert's whispers. When the sun dipped toward the horizon, Ethan lit a small camp stove and heated a tin of beans. The scent rose into the air, mingling with the sharp smell of dust and stone. That night the desert came alive. Coyotes called to one another across the dunes, their cries high and haunting. The wind picked up, carrying sand that hissed against the tent's canvas walls. Above, the stars burst into brilliance, a tapestry so vast and sharp that Ethan felt both insignificant and strangely comforted. He lay back on his sleeping bag, Rex at his feet, and stared upward. The silence of the desert was heavy, but it was a natural weight, unlike the oppressive silence of his old apartment. Here, the earth itself seemed to acknowledge his grief and give it room to breathe. In the quiet hours before dawn, Ethan dreamed of his son. The boy had been only 20 when he died, full of laughter and restless energy. Ethan had always been the stern father, the one who worried over rules and discipline. He had expected to see his son soar, perhaps even follow him into the field of aviation. Instead, life had stolen him too soon, leaving Ethan with regrets that gnawed like rust on metal. He awoke before sunrise, breath sharp, tears drying on his cheeks. Rex stirred and pressed his head against Ethan's chest, as if to remind him that not everything had been taken away. Morning came pale and cool, the desert still cloaked in shadows. Ethan packed his gear with deliberate motions, his hands steady despite the ache in his chest. He had no destination beyond forward, no purpose beyond survival and the search for quiet. With Rex leading the way, they set off once more into the desert's endless expanse. The rising sun cast long shadows across the sand, painting the world in gold and crimson. The air shimmered with promise and menace alike. Ethan walked with the steady determination of a man who had nothing left to lose but his breath. Every step carried him farther from the life he had abandoned, deeper into the wilderness where he hoped, perhaps foolishly, to find healing. And somewhere ahead, buried beneath the sands and forgotten by time, something waited for him and Rex, something that would shatter the stillness he sought and tie his life to a mystery he could never have imagined. The second morning in the desert rose with a merciless brilliance, the horizon aflame as the sun pushed itself above the dunes. Ethan trudged forward with Rex beside him, their shadows stretching long across the sand like two dark signatures. The air was crisp in the early hours, but he knew soon the heat would gather with a vengeance, suffocating and relentless. The desert was an unforgiving teacher, and Ethan respected its rules. Move early, rest at midday, conserve water, and trust nothing that seemed easy. Rex padded steadily on his right, ears flicking at the faint calls of distant birds. His tongue lolled slightly, but his gait never faltered. The German shepherd carried himself with an effortless authority, tail swishing in rhythm, muscles rippling beneath his coat. He was not simply a pet, but a partner, a silent sentinel who sensed the desert more deeply than Ethan could. Often the man found himself watching Rex for cues, whether danger was near, whether the ground was steady, whether the silence was ordinary or ominous. The landscape changed as they pressed forward. Towering dunes gave way to jagged mesas, the earth burned red with iron-rich stone. Fragments of shale littered the ground like broken glass, and the wind sang through narrow canyons with a voice both mournful and sharp. Ethan climbed a ridge of sandstone, boots slipping on loose gravel, and when he reached the top, he paused. Before him stretched a valley of golden sand, broken by scattered outcrops. In the distance, heat shimmered like an illusory sea, Rex stiffened. The dog's head shot forward, ears standing tall, body tense. A deep growl rumbled in his chest, low but insistent. Ethan followed the line of his gaze and saw it a glimmer beneath the sand, a faint metallic sparkle catching the Sunday. At first it looked like nothing more than trash, some forgotten scrap of metal carried by wind or storm. But Rex barked once, sharp and commanding, as though telling him this was no ordinary fragment. Ethan descended the slope carefully, stones tumbling under his boots. When he reached the object, he knelt and brushed the sand away with gloved fingers. The desert resisted, clinging to the shard, but slowly the shape revealed itself. A jagged edge of polished aluminum, dulled by time yet unmistakably crafted by human hands. It was not a simple can or tool, it was part of something larger, something once alive with speed and power. He leaned back on his heels, studying the shard. The edges were twisted, scorched in places, as though they had endured fire. Ethan's mind ticked with the logic of an engineer. The alloy, the curvature, the thickness. This was no casual debris. This was aviation metal. His chest tightened. Rex barked again and moved ahead, nose pressed to the sand. The dog traced a path, pausing, sniffing, then surging forward with renewed urgency. Ethan rose quickly, brushing dust from his hands, and followed. The trail led away from the shard, a faint indentation in the sand, as though something massive had once been dragged or buried beneath shifting dunes. Ethan's boots sank with each step as he hurried after his dog, sweat rolling down his temple despite the morning air. The further they went, the more the trail revealed itself. Here and there, other fragments jutted from the sand, a twisted bolt, a curved panel streaked with faded paint, a piece of shattered glass like frozen smoke. The desert had tried to swallow them, but not entirely. It was as if the earth itself had grown weary of hiding what lay beneath. At last, they crested a dune, and Ethan stopped dead. His breath caught in his throat, his pulse hammering in his ears. Before him lay a structure so vast it dwarfed the surrounding stone. The desert had half buried it, sand piled high against its frame, but there was no mistaking its shape. The skeletal remains of a private jet, broken and decayed yet still immense, resting like a fallen giant among the dunes. The fuselage lay cracked open. One wing snapped clean from the body and jutting upward at an unnatural angle. The tail fin stood tall, faded and blistered, its logo erased by decades of wind and Sunday. Windows, once clear, were clouded and fractured. The desert had gnawed at the machine, rusting its bones. But even in ruin, it radiated an aura of wealth and tragedy. Ethan's mouth went dry. He had seen many aircraft in his career, from sleek corporate jets to colossal transports. This one, even in death, carried the air of exclusivity. Its lines were not utilitarian, but elegant, crafted for those who traveled above the world in privilege. He tried to imagine the day it fell, the roar of engines, the panic inside, the final silence as it struck earth. His mind recoiled, unsettled. Rex barked again, circling near the torn fuselage, nose pressed against seams of rust. The dog whined softly, pawing at the sand where shards of glass glinted. Ethan forced his legs to move, descending the slope toward the wreckage. Each step felt heavy, as though gravity itself resisted his approach. The air grew hotter, pressing against him like a hand. At the base of the wreck, Ethan reached out and placed a hand against the metal. It was hot from the sun, rough with corrosion. His glove rasped against it, and a shiver passed through him. The plane was real, not a mirage conjured by heat or exhaustion. It had been here for decades, hidden in plain sight. And somehow, he, of all people, had found it. He circled slowly, scanning the ground. Scattered luggage lay half buried, corners of leather trunks and the handles of cases jutting from the sand. He crouched beside one and tugged, but it was wedged deep, the desert clinging to its prize. Nearby, a half-torn seat cushion lay exposed, foam spilling like yellow dust. His engineer's eye catalogued every detail, the trajectory of the wreckage, the pattern of the debris. This plane had not simply fallen, it had torn itself apart on impact. Rex whined. Again, tail low, ears back. The dog was uneasy, and Ethan could feel it too. There was something unsettling about the silence, the way the wreck sat half-swallowed, as if deliberately hidden. He looked around, scanning the dunes. No buzzards circled, no bones lay bleached in the Sunday, only sand wreckage and the steady thrum of his own heartbeat. He stood still for a long moment, sweat dripping into his beard. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "What the hell happened here?" The desert offered no answer. The wind blew softly, carrying a hiss across the dunes, like the faint echo of a memory long buried. The desert sun pressed hard against Ethan's back as he stood at the threshold of the wreck. The plane loomed before him, its broken fuselage tilted at an angle, one wing severed and the other half buried in sand. Time had transformed the jet into something more like a ruin than a machine, its body torn and rusted, its frame moaning faintly under the weight of wind. Rex paced in tight circles, his paws crunching over broken glass and scattered bolts, ears twitching at every faint groan from the metal shell. The German shepherd's amber eyes were wide, tail stiff, signaling both fear and vigilance. Ethan laid a hand on the dog's back, feeling the steady tremor of tension running through his companion. "Easy, boy," he murmured, though his own voice betrayed unease. Ethan approached what had once been the cabin door, though now it hung twisted and warped. The hinges creaked as he forced it wider, the groan of old metal rising like a protest from the grave. Dust swirled in the sudden shaft of sunlight. He raised his arm to shield his face, then ducked inside. Rex followed reluctantly, his nails clicking on the warped flooring. The interior was darker than Ethan expected. Pale light filtered through cracked windows and gashes in the fuselage, beams cutting through the dust like searchlights. For a moment, he stood still, letting his eyes adjust. The smell struck him first, a stale odor of rust, mildew, and something older, like forgotten fabric left too long in dampness. Rows of leather seats stretched unevenly down the aisle, many torn open, their stuffing yellow and brittle with age. Some lay toppled, others skewed sideways as though thrown violently during the crash. In the dim light, their shapes resembled broken teeth jutting from a jaw. Rex sniffed one cautiously, then sneezed, recoiling from the musty stench. Ethan moved forward, boots crunching on fragments of glass and twisted metal. Near the middle of the cabin, he found a pile of luggage wedged against the wall. Expensive leather trunks, designer suitcases, and garment bags had burst open, their contents scattered. Dresses of silk lay crumpled and dulled by dust, their once brilliant colors faded to muted ghosts. Tailored suits, pressed with care decades earlier, now sagged like deflated skins. A velvet jewelry case had toppled, spilling bracelets, rings, and necklaces across the floor. Jewels caught the shafts of light, winking faintly amid the decay. Ethan crouched, fingertips brushing a diamond necklace. Even covered in grime, the stones sparkled with haunting beauty. He pulled his hand back quickly, unwilling to pocket anything. It felt wrong, as though the wreck was not simply debris but a tomb. To take from it would be like robbing the dead. As he explored, Ethan's mind worked with the instincts of an engineer. This was no ordinary flight. The seating arrangements, the lavish luggage, the very design of the interior suggested wealth. Whoever had traveled in this jet had been powerful, or at least wealthy enough to live above ordinary fears. And yet, here in the desert, their wealth had offered no protection. He continued down the aisle, Rex trailing close at his side. Every sound echoed strangely: the creak of flooring, the hiss of sand sliding through cracks, the whistle of wind. Each echo carried the suggestion that others walked nearby, unseen. Ethan stopped once, flashlight beam sweeping across the cabin, convinced for an instant that movement flickered in the shadows. But there was nothing, only empty seats and silence. Toward the rear of the plane, he found personal effects scattered like breadcrumbs from another era. A golden wristwatch lay broken on the floor, its hands frozen at 2:17. Nearby, an ivory comb with missing teeth rested against a seat cushion. A slim cigarette case bore initials engraved in delicate cursive. RM. Ethan held it up to the light, turning it in his hand, then slipped it back onto the seat where he found it. He paused at a particularly large trunk wedged in the corner. The leather had cracked, but the brass buckles still gleamed faintly. He knelt, tugged the straps free, and pried it open. Inside were coats of fur, expensive and heavy, still intact despite the years. He brushed his hand over one and frowned. Even through gloves, the fur was soft, too pristine. The desert preserved things strangely, robbing them of decay, but not of memory. He shut the trunk and stood. Rex barked suddenly, sharp and urgent, startling Ethan. The dog had wandered a few steps down the aisle, nose pressed against the wall of the fuselage. He pawed at the metal, whining. Ethan hurried to him and saw it. Faint scratches etched into the panel, barely visible in the dim light. He angled his flashlight, and the marks became clear. They were deliberate, carved by human hands. Not random gouges from the crash, but purposeful lines, tallies perhaps, or desperate messages. Ethan traced them with gloved fingers, his chest tightening. Survivors. Someone had lived inside this wreck after it fell. The air grew heavier around him. He turned slowly, gaze sweeping over the cabin. Every broken seat, every scattered jewel, seemed transformed. This was not simply a wreck. It was a stage for something unfinished. Where were the survivors now? Why had no trace of them been found? Why had no one come to claim this plane? His heart beat faster, and he found himself whispering into the silence. What happened here? The desert wind moaned through a crack in the fuselage, answering with a sound that was almost a sigh. Ethan lingered longer, exploring each section of the cabin, but no bodies lay within. No bones, no remains, not even scraps of clothing that suggested a human end. The absence was more terrifying than presence could have been. It was as if the plane had swallowed its passengers whole and left only the artifacts of wealth behind. At last, he returned to the broken doorway. Rex pressed against his leg, eyes fixed on the dunes outside. The sun was lower now, shadows growing across the sand. Ethan stood framed in the doorway, staring out at the endless desert. Behind him lay a graveyard with no dead, a vault of secrets preserved by silence. He knew in his bones that this was no ordinary crash. It was a mystery deliberately hidden, one that had waited decades for him to stumble upon. And now, he and Rex were bound to it. The air inside the wreck was colder than the desert outside, as though the broken fuselage had trapped shadows for decades. Ethan stood in the aisle for a long moment, staring at the scratched marks on the metal wall. His mind churned. Survivors. The thought carried both relief and dread. Survivors meant there had once been hope, but their absence now screamed of a darker fate. Rex whined softly, nudging Ethan's leg, amber eyes glowing in the weak light filtering through the torn fuselage. The German shepherd's tail was low, his body tense, as though sensing something his master could not. Ethan steadied himself and moved toward the cockpit. The door was half torn from its hinges, jagged metal jutting like teeth. He pushed through carefully, boots crunching on shattered glass and twisted instruments. The cockpit was a graveyard of technology panels smashed, dials frozen, wires hanging like vines. Dust coated everything, muting the once sophisticated control center into something skeletal. Yet beneath the decay, there were hints of humanity. On the co-pilot's seat lay a flight cap, its fabric stiff with age. Ethan picked it up, turning it in his hands, then set it back gently. His flashlight swept the floor, where papers lay scattered. Most were water-stained. Ink bled into illegibility. But one leather-bound book sat wedged beneath the throttle quadrant. He pulled it free, brushing away layers of dust. The cover bore faint embossed letters, Captain J. Harrison. Captain James Harrison had once been a man of authority, Ethan realized, just by touching the log. Though Ethan had never met him, He imagined the kind of figure he must have been: strong-jawed, disciplined, a man with short-cropped, dark hair, and the steady gaze of someone used to command. The kind of pilot who had faced storms and long hours, who had been trusted with the lives of the wealthy passengers who boarded this jet. And yet, here his record remained, abandoned, in ruin. Ethan opened the book, flipping past early entries of weather conditions and flight schedules until he reached the final pages. His pulse quickened. The handwriting was hurried, slanted, almost desperate. Impact survivable. Many injured, but alive. Plane broken. Comms gone. Desert unforgiving. Passengers frightened. Some hysterical. The next entry read, "We ration water. Food limited. Built small fire at night. Spirits low." Ethan's breath caught as he turned to the final legible page. Day 5. Supplies dwindling. Some cannot walk. We carve tallies to mark the days. Cold nights worse than heat. Crew struggling to keep order. God help us. The handwriting trailed off into smudges, as if the pen had slipped from weary hands. Ethan closed the logbook slowly, staring at the cover. Survivors had indeed lived here after the crash. They had lit fires, counted days, tried to hold on, and yet they had vanished. No bodies, no bones, no graves marked in the sand. Rex barked once, sharp and urgent. Ethan turned. The dog had moved back into the cabin, nose pressed low against the flooring near a torn panel. Ethan followed quickly, shining his flashlight. The beam caught faint discoloration on the metal floor, blackened patches as though a fire had once been built there. Charcoal dust clung in corners. Fragments of ash still nestled against the seams. He crouched, running gloved fingers over the brittle remains. Survivors had indeed gathered here, fighting the cold desert nights. Rex whined again, pawing at the floor. Ethan stood and stepped back. The dog moved toward a gap near the rear of the fuselage, where the body of the plane had split on impact. The sand sloped upward through the torn opening, a natural ramp leading out into the desert. Ethan followed, his boots crunching softly. As he neared the exit, his beam of light caught something else. Shallow grooves etched into the sand beyond the wreck. He crouched again, heart thudding. The grooves ran parallel, long and narrow, as if something heavy had been dragged. He traced them with his fingers, feeling the subtle depressions hardened by decades of sun and wind. Not the work of animals, not the randomness of erosion. These were deliberate. Survivors had pulled something, crates, trunks, perhaps wounded companions, away from the plane. But to where? The desert stretched silent and infinite, offering no answer. Ethan stood, staring into the darkness beyond, imagination racing. He pictured a group of survivors, some limping, others hauling supplies. Rex's distant ancestors sniffing at their trail. He imagined Captain Harrison at their head, his face lined with exhaustion but determined, guiding wealthy passengers who had never known hardship into a wilderness that cared nothing for their status. Ethan's mind caught on the absence of closure. If they had left, why had no sign of them been found? Why had their story vanished, swallowed by sand and time? His stomach clenched. Secrets lived here, secrets powerful enough that no government, no rescue party, no news archive had ever told this tale. Rex pressed closer to him, nose twitching, body tense. The dog gave a low growl, staring out into the dunes. Ethan followed his gaze but saw nothing, only the shifting sands under moonlight. Still, the unease grew. He tucked the logbook into his pack, unwilling to leave it behind. If answers existed, perhaps they were written in those pages between the lines, waiting for someone to piece them together. The wind picked up, hissing through the torn fuselage, scattering dust like restless spirits. Ethan stepped back inside, pulling Rex with him. He stood in the cabin once more, surrounded by ruined luxury silk dresses, broken jewelry, shattered glass, and realized he could no longer see it as mere wreckage. This was a place of endurance, a monument to people who had once fought desperately for life. But where they had gone, and why nothing remained of them, lingered like a shadow on the edge of his thoughts. He settled against a broken seat, Rex lying at his feet, the logbook heavy in his pack. He whispered into the silence, almost a vow. "I'll find out what happened here." The desert did not reply. Only the faint moan of wind through steel, and the steady, loyal breathing of Rex, filled the dark. The night pressed heavily on Ethan as he tried to sleep inside the wreck, the captain's journal tucked in his pack like a silent weight. Every time the wind groaned through the fuselage, it seemed to carry voices, whispers of those who had once been here, men and women, clinging to life before vanishing into the desert. Rex slept lightly beside him, body twitching with alert dreams, ears flicking at every sound. Ethan dozed fitfully until dawn finally broke, painting the dunes with streaks of orange and red. He left the wreck soon after sunrise, Rex bounding ahead, nose lowered to the sand. The grooves outside the fuselage had etched themselves into Ethan's mind, a trail carved not by chance, but by desperate hands. He followed the dog as they moved farther into the desert, where the dunes rose taller and the rocks grew sharper. The heat began to swell quickly, and Ethan adjusted the brim of his hat, sweat gathering in his beard. The land shifted into harsher terrain. Towering walls of stone created a labyrinth of gullies and ridges, shadows stretching long between them. Rex barked once, darting toward a narrow gap in the sandstone. Ethan followed, slipping through the passage until the world opened into a small ravine. There, half hidden among stones, he saw them faint scratches across the rock face. He crouched, brushing the dust away. The marks were deliberate, gouged by sharp metal or stone. They formed no words, only ragged lines, as though someone had clawed in frustration or desperation. Ethan ran his fingers along them, imagining a woman's trembling hand or a child's frantic scrape. These were not random. These were signs of struggle, signs of people trying to leave proof they had been here. Rex growled softly and tugged toward a tangle of rocks. Ethan followed, his boots crunching against loose gravel. There, caught in a crack, he found it, a piece of faded fabric. It was once fine silk, pale blue, now frayed and dulled by decades of Sunday he lifted it carefully, the threads disintegrating between his gloved fingers. He pictured the kind of woman who might have worn such cloth, tall, elegant, with hair pinned carefully, skin pale under desert sun, her hands unaccustomed to hardship, someone wealthy, dragged into survival. But the trail ended abruptly. Beyond the ravine, there were no more scratches, no more cloth, no footprints etched in stone. It was as if the survivors had been swallowed whole, their path vanishing into emptiness. Ethan stood still, unease settling like dust in his lungs. Rex circled nearby, sniffing furiously. His paw struck something half buried in the sand. Ethan knelt and brushed it free. A thick envelope, sealed with a brittle wax that cracked under his touch. The paper was yellowed, edges curled, but still intact. He hesitated, then tore it open. Inside lay a stack of documents, the ink faded but legible. His eyes scanned the first lines, and his breath caught. They were contracts, memoranda, and letters marked with government seals and corporate insignias. The words spoke of trade agreements, covert transactions, and financial exchanges between powerful figures, politicians, industrial magnates, international brokers. There were signatures he recognized from history books, names that once graced headlines and shaped policy. Ethan sat back heavily on a rock, the envelope trembling in his hands. This was no ordinary passenger list. The jet had carried not just the wealthy, but the powerful. Men and women entangled in politics and finance at the highest level. Secrets lay within these papers. Secrets dangerous enough to alter nations, to destroy careers, perhaps even to spark wars if revealed at the wrong moment. He looked at Rex, who tilted his head, ears pricked as though asking what troubled his master. Ethan whispered, "This was never just an accident." The weight of revelation settled over him. The survivors had left this trail, perhaps carrying similar documents, dragging trunks filled not with food but with secrets. And then disappearance. No graves, no bones, no stories told. Ethan shivered despite the rising heat. He tucked the envelope carefully into his pack, pressing it between the logbook and his canteen. A decision loomed: to keep moving, to follow where the vanished had gone, or to turn back and pretend none of this existed. He looked at the ravine one last time, at the claw marks and the faded silk. They whispered of people who had struggled, suffered, and vanished. The wind swept through the canyon, carrying sand that hissed against stone. Rex growled again, tail low, uneasy. Ethan laid a hand on the dog's head, grounding himself in the animal's steady warmth. He whispered again, almost to himself, "We're in something bigger than us, boy. Something buried for a reason." As the sun reached its zenith, Ethan led Rex out of the ravine. He did not know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing with certainty. The desert was not done with him yet. The desert evening fell quickly, shadows stretching until they merged into one vast black sea. Ethan and Rex made their way back toward the plane wreck before darkness swallowed the ravine. The documents he had found weighed heavily in his pack, heavier still in his mind. Secrets of governments and magnates, hidden in the desert for decades, and now carried by a broken engineer and his loyal dog. He knew too much already. The air cooled with alarming speed. Where hours earlier the heat had pressed against his skin like fire, now the wind cut sharp and cold. Sand hissed over the dunes, first in trickles, then in streams. Ethan glanced skyward. The moon was veiled by shifting clouds, and a low hum rolled across the desert. Rex whined and pressed closer to his leg, his ears twitching nervously. By the time they reached the fuselage, the sandstorm had fully awakened. Winds slammed against the broken jet, shrieking through cracks and torn seams. Ethan shoved the warped door shut as best he could and crouched inside, his flashlight casting thin circles of light across the cabin. The noise outside was deafening, a constant roar punctuated by the metallic groans of the wreck itself. It felt less like shelter than a coffin rattling in the earth. Rex circled tightly, claws tapping on the metal floor, before settling near Ethan's boots. His hackles stood on end, amber eyes locked on the shadows at the far end of the cabin. A low growl rumbled in his chest, steady and dangerous. Ethan stiffened. He lifted the flashlight and swept it across the cabin. Broken seats, scattered luggage, scraps of clothing, and nothing else. Still, the sense of presence lingered. The storm outside seemed to bleed into the wreck, its voice transformed into whispers and footsteps. Ethan's breathing grew shallow. He thought of the survivors, their claw marks on the stone, their desperate tally lines scratched into metal. Were these sounds nothing but wind? Or echoes of those who had once huddled here, their lives ending in silence? He pressed his back against a seat, Rex bristling beside him. The dog suddenly barked, sharp and loud, the sound ricocheting off the steel walls. He lunged toward the dark corner, teeth bared, as though confronting something invisible. Ethan surged forward, flashlight beam slicing through the dust-choked air. For an instant, he swore he saw movement, a shadow withdrawing into the gloom, shaped vaguely like a man. His heart slammed against his ribs, but there was nothing there, only the broken wall of the fuselage and the endless roar of wind. Ethan returned to his spot, clutching the logbook in one hand like a talisman. His rational mind screamed that exhaustion and fear were playing tricks. Yet another part of him, the part that had carried grief like a stone for years, whispered that some truths were not bound by logic. Perhaps those who had vanished had never truly left. Perhaps they lingered, bound to the desert, bound to this plain, bound to the secrets that should have died with them. Hours passed in fractured silence. Ethan closed his eyes, but the storm's voice filled the cabin. He dreamed, if it was dreaming at all, of figures moving past him. A woman draped in silk, tall, with dark hair pinned back, and pale skin streaked by sand, eyes hollow yet pleading. A man in a tailored suit, square-jawed with a trimmed mustache, his hands bleeding as he dragged a heavy trunk across the desert floor. Children's voices, faint, calling for water. Ethan jolted awake. sweat cold on his skin, Rex staring at him as if to ask whether he had seen it too. The storm raged on. At one point, Ethan thought he heard the creak of boots on metal, deliberate, not random. He swung the flashlight again, but saw only Rex, hackles raised, teeth bared at an empty aisle. The sound faded into the storm. Then, amid the roar, Ethan understood something that froze him deeper than the cold air ever could. The survivors might not have vanished by chance. They might have been forced into disappearance, hunted, silenced, erased. Perhaps those documents in his pack had been dangerous enough to doom every soul aboard. Perhaps someone had ensured no story of their survival ever reached the world. The thought coiled inside him like a snake. He pressed Rex close, whispering, "We shouldn't be here." The dog leaned against him, steady and warm, a living anchor against the weight of unseen eyes. When dawn finally cracked through the storm, it came as a pale and ghostly light. The wind slowed, carrying sand that sifted down like fine ash. Ethan pushed open the twisted door, blinking against the brightness. Dunes had shifted overnight, half burying the fuselage anew, erasing footprints and trails. The desert had rewritten itself, as if determined to cover every scar, every secret. Ethan stepped out, the logbook and envelope secure in his pack, Rex by his side. He looked back once at the wreck, its broken silhouette jutting from the sand like a monument. The memory of the storm lingered in his bones, the whispers, the footsteps, the shadow that might have been real or not. But the conclusion he carried now was sharp and unavoidable. The people on that plane had not simply died, they had been silenced. The desert lay transformed in the aftermath of the storm. Dunes had shifted like restless giants, swallowing old paths and shaping new ridges. The wreck of the jet sat half buried once more, its jagged fuselage protruding like the bones of some long-dead beast. Ethan stood at the threshold of the torn doorway, Rex pressed against his side, both of them weary yet unwilling to let go of what the night had shown them. The storm had stripped him of illusions. He could not pretend this discovery was a mere accident of history. The survivors had not simply faded into the desert, they had been silenced, their story erased with deliberate precision. The documents in his pack throbbed like a second heartbeat, a reminder that he carried something men had once died to conceal. Rex barked once, sharp and decisive, as though urging him forward. The dog's sable coat was dusted with fine sand, his amber eyes alert despite exhaustion. Ethan crouched, running a hand along Rex's sturdy back, finding comfort in the dog's steady warmth. "Time to go, boy," he murmured. His voice was hoarse, not just from sand, but from the weight of decision. He stepped outside, boots sinking into the newly formed dunes. The sun had risen pale and hard, glaring down from a washed-out sky. The heat was already rising, yet the desert felt colder than before, as though the secrets buried beneath it had leached warmth from the earth. Ethan turned back once. The plane looked smaller now, half consumed by sand, its broken wing jutting upward like a final salute. He hesitated. For a moment, every instinct told him to keep searching, to chase the vanished path of the survivors, to dig deeper into the tomb of steel and silence. But reason pressed harder. The desert had nearly broken him in one night. Another storm might finish the job. And beyond survival, there was Rex. The dog leaned into him, tail low, eyes fixed on the horizon. Rex wanted to leave. Ethan adjusted his pack, feeling the weight of the logbook and the envelope inside. They were more than evidence. They were curses. He had sought silence and found it, but not the kind he expected. This silence carried voices, ghosts whispering of power, corruption, and death. He and Rex began their march. The dunes stretched endlessly, their crests gleaming like molten gold under the Sunday. Each step was heavy, but Ethan kept a rhythm, one boot in front of the other, his breaths measured, his eyes scanning the horizon for familiar ridges. Rex trotted steadily ahead, pausing now and then to sniff the sand, guiding them towards safer ground. Hours passed. The desert gave no mercy. The wind rose again, though gentler than the night before. carrying whispers that seemed to chase them from behind. Ethan forced himself not to look back. He knew what he would see: the wreck slowly disappearing beneath the dunes, as though the desert itself sought to erase it once more. At midday, Ethan and Rex stopped beneath the shadow of a sandstone outcrop. He dropped heavily onto a flat rock, drinking sparingly from his canteen. Rex lapped from a small metal bowl, panting with gratitude. Ethan leaned his head back against the stone, closing his eyes. The storm's echoes replayed in his mind. The footsteps that weren't his, the shadows that shouldn't exist, the cold certainty that the survivors had not vanished freely. A choice gnawed at him. He could deliver the documents to the world, expose what had been hidden, shake the pillars of governments and corporations, or he could keep them buried, a secret too dangerous for any man to hold. Neither path brought peace. He opened his eyes to the sight of Rex watching him, ears perked, head tilted. In those amber eyes, Ethan found his answer. Some truths were not meant to be shouted into the world. Some were burdens one carried quietly, protecting not nations but the fragile lives closest to them. He had already lost a son. He would not risk losing this companion to the weight of other people's wars. When they rose again, the desert seemed to shift behind them. The wreck was gone, swallowed whole. Ethan knew it was still there, buried beneath sand and silence, but to the eye it had vanished, as though it had never existed. The flying tomb had reclaimed itself, leaving only him and Rex as its reluctant witnesses. By the time the horizon softened with the glow of evening, Ethan felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter because each step carried him farther from the ghosts. Heavier because he carried them within him now, bound to his soul like shadows that would never fade. As they descended toward the valley where his truck awaited, Ethan stopped once more. He turned, staring at the vast dunes behind. His lips parted, whispering words only Rex could hear. "Part of me will never leave that place." Rex pressed against his leg, tail swishing gently, grounding him once again. Together, man and dog walked on, leaving behind the flying tomb but never escaping it fully. Sometimes, the desert buries more than wreckage. It buries truth, pain, and memories too heavy for one man to carry. Yet in the silence, Ethan learned what so many of us forget, that survival itself is a miracle, and loyalty, like Rex's steadfast love, is one of God's greatest gifts. We may not all uncover hidden jets or secret histories, but each of us walks through deserts of our own loneliness, grief, unanswered questions, and even in those barren places, the Lord leaves us reminders, a loyal friend, a flicker of hope, a whisper in the wind that says, "You are not alone." If you're listening now, take this story as more than mystery. It is testimony that faith can guide us through storms, that love can keep us standing when the world erases every path. May God bless you wherever you are watching from. May He guide your steps, calm your storms, and remind you that even in the deepest silence, His presence is near. Before you go, tell us in the comments what this story meant to you. Share it with someone who needs hope today, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next journey. And may the Lord's blessing be upon you and your family, now and always.